Before the stone moved, before the cross was lifted, before anyone dared whisper the word resurrection with trembling breath, there was only a man, and a world that did not notice him. At first, he was not born into power, not in Rome's marble shadow, not beneath banners or among men whose names carried weight. He came into the world quietly, in a land already claimed by someone else. Judea did not belong to its people. It belonged to Rome. Rome controlled everything: the roads, the taxes, the courts, the soldiers. Rome decided who lived quietly and who died publicly. And into that machine, into that occupied tension, Jesus was born. Not as a threat. Not yet. He came from places people dismissed without thinking. Bethlehem, Nazareth, locations that didn't produce kings, didn't shape empires, didn't matter to anyone who mattered. He had no rank, no title, no visible claim to significance. He worked with his hands, lived without spectacle, grew without announcement. If you passed him in those early years, you would not have stopped. You would not have known. And that was the point, because nothing about him forced attention, until he chose to take it. When he stepped into the open, it wasn't with force, it was with presence. No army, no declaration of war, just a voice that carried something people could not quite name. He spoke to the poor like they were seen, to the broken like they were not finished, to the forgotten like they still mattered. And people felt it, not because it was loud, but because it was close. Too close. He spoke of God as if distance had collapsed. Not ritual, not performance, not something locked behind temple walls. He spoke like heaven had stepped forward and was now standing within reach. And then he began to move. Through villages, along the shoreline, into the spaces where pain lived in plain sight. He healed the sick, restored the outcast, touched what others avoided, sat with people society had already written off. And everywhere he went, something followed him. Tension. Not the kind you can ignore, the kind that spreads. Because what he was doing wasn't just kindness, it was disruption. He forgave sins out loud, claimed authority where no one expected it, spoke in ways that didn't ask permission from the systems already in place. He didn't work within the structure, he stepped around it. And that is when things began to shift, because power can tolerate noise. It cannot tolerate replacement. The crowds grew, the questions followed. Who is he? What is he doing? And the most dangerous one, what if he's right? Because if he was, then everything built on control, hierarchy, and fear began to feel thinner than it should. Rome understood force. But this wasn't force. This was something harder to kill. People weren't just listening to him. They were beginning to believe him. And belief doesn't need weapons to become dangerous. That is the moment a man stops being invisible. The moment he stops being manageable. The moment he becomes something else entirely. Not just a teacher. Not just a voice. But a problem. A question that refuses to go away. A center that everything else begins to orbit, whether it wants to or not. Because in a world built on control, a man who commands loyalty without power is never just a man.
And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. Matthew 7, verse 29.
By the time Jesus reached Jerusalem, the city was already restless in a way that could not be easily named, as though something unseen had begun to press inward from every direction, tightening the air and sharpening every movement. Passover always carried that effect. It drew people in from across the land, families, pilgrims, travelers moving along worn roads with memory in their hands and expectation in their chests, until the streets filled beyond their natural limits and the city itself seemed to swell under the weight of remembrance. Because this was not just a gathering. It was a reminder of what it meant to be free. And Rome did not tolerate reminders like that without watching closely. So they watched. They placed more soldiers where eyes could see them, and more where eyes could not, allowing presence itself to act as a warning, while tension settled quietly beneath ordinary life, unnoticed by some, but deeply felt by others. Nothing had broken, but nothing was fully at peace. And into that fragile balance, at the precise moment when attention was most dangerous, Jesus chose to be seen. He did not enter the city in silence, nor did he move along its edges as someone attempting to avoid notice. Instead, he came through the main approach where visibility was unavoidable, seated not upon a warhorse as Rome would have recognized, but upon a donkey, a detail that might seem small to some, yet carried the echo of something older to those who remembered. And the crowd responded. Not slowly, not cautiously, but with a kind of rising energy that moved faster than control could contain, as people laid down cloaks in the road, cut branches from nearby trees, and lifted their voices in a cry that spread not by command, but by recognition. Hosanna! A word that held more than one meaning. A cry for salvation. A shout of praise. A sound that could be heard as celebration, or as expectation beginning to take form. Because crowds do not gather like that without cause. They gather when something has already begun to shift beneath the surface, when belief has moved quietly through people long before it becomes visible. And in that moment, what had been growing in private became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a teacher moving quietly among villages. This was a man being received like a king, within a city controlled by Rome. That kind of moment does not pass unnoticed. The religious leaders saw it immediately, not simply as a disturbance, but as a signal. The watchers saw it, measuring its implications. And whether Rome reacted at once or only after word reached them, it no longer mattered. The threshold had already been crossed. Yet Jesus did not hesitate, nor did he retreat from the attention that had formed around him. Instead, he moved directly toward the temple, the center of religious authority, the place where order was not merely taught, but maintained, where power existed behind ritual and structure, and where influence was both visible and protected. And when he entered that space, he did not observe. He acted. Tables were overturned with force that could not be mistaken for symbolism, coins scattering across the stone floor in sharp, uncontrolled motion, animals breaking loose in confusion as voices rose in shock and anger, while those who had settled comfortably into that system were suddenly driven out of it. It was not subtle. It was not restrained. It was confrontation made visible. And in that moment, something irreversible took place. Because this was no longer a man offering ideas or challenging interpretations from a distance. This was a man stepping into the center of power and refusing to submit to it. From that point forward, the question itself changed. It was no longer asked in curiosity. Who is he? It was asked in urgency. How long can this continue? The answer did not arrive all at once, nor was it spoken openly at first. Instead, it formed in quieter spaces, in conversations that did not require volume to carry weight, in exchanged glances between those who understood what was at stake, and in the gradual agreement that something had to be done before the situation moved beyond control. But there was a complication. Jesus was not alone. He had followers, crowds, people who listened, who watched, who believed. To take him openly risked creating the very unrest they were trying to prevent. And so the solution required timing, precision, silence. And that opportunity emerged from the least expected place, within his own circle. Judas. We are not given a clean explanation for what led him to that moment, no simple motive that settles comfortably into understanding. Perhaps expectation turned into disappointment, or belief into frustration, or perhaps the reasons are more complex than any single explanation could contain. But the result is clear. He agreed to lead them to Jesus, not in daylight, but in absence. Night settled over the city, and with it came a quiet that felt temporary, as though something beneath it was already moving. Outside the noise, in a place called Gethsemane, Jesus stood with those closest to him, while the world beyond that space continued without awareness of what was about to unfold. Here, the pace changes, because something in him already knows. He steps away from the others, not in fear, but in wait, as he prays in a way that reflects a burden the others cannot fully grasp, leaving them nearby, present but not fully aware, while the stillness deepens. And then, movement. Light appears in the distance. Torches, Footsteps. Not disordered, not chaotic, but directed, intentional. They arrive not as a crowd, but as a force with purpose. Soldiers, officials, men who are not there to question, but to conclude. Judas walks ahead of them. He does not shout. He does not signal from afar. He steps close and kisses him, a gesture of familiarity, a mark of identification. And in that moment, everything that had been building quietly across days and weeks and months locks into place. The reaction is immediate but brief: confusion, fear, a flicker of resistance. But it dissolves almost as quickly as it begins, because this was never meant to become a fight. Jesus is taken, not seized in chaos, not dragged through violence, but led away with a finality that does not require force to be understood. And just like that, the man who had moved freely among crowds no longer does. The night does not soften. It sharpens. He is questioned, accused, moved between authorities who are no longer seeking clarity, but confirmation, not trying to understand him, but to bring the process to its intended end. Eventually, he is brought before Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor whose concern is not belief, nor theology, nor truth in any abstract sense, but stability, order maintained, unrest avoided, control preserved. Pilate looks for something clear, something actionable, something that justifies what is being demanded. But the situation around him is already shifting, shaped not only by evidence, but by pressure, by voices that are growing louder, by attention that is no longer contained. And in Rome's world, hesitation carries its own risk, because unrest spreads faster than certainty. So the question changes. It is no longer, is he guilty? It becomes, what happens if I refuse? And that question has only one answer that feels safe. Pilate authorizes the execution, not because the case is clean, but because the alternative feels more dangerous. And with that decision, the path narrows completely. There is no reversal, no interruption, no escape. The man who entered the city surrounded by voices will leave it carrying a cross.
And Pilate said unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. Matthew 27, verse 22.
By the time the sentence was given, the ending had already taken shape long before anyone spoke it aloud, because in Rome's world, once a decision reached this point, it was no longer a matter of if something would happen, but only how completely it would be carried out. There would be no imprisonment, no quiet exile, no disappearance that allowed memory to soften the edges of what had taken place. Rome did not hide its punishments. It displayed them, because crucifixion was not merely a method of execution. It was a message written in the body, delivered in public, and intended to be remembered long after the victim was gone. Before Jesus ever reached the cross, the process had already begun in a way designed to weaken not only the body, but the will to endure what followed. He was scourged. A Roman flogging was not restrained or symbolic, but calculated, carried out with leather whips embedded with fragments of bone or metal that tore into the skin with each strike, opening the body in a way that made every movement afterward more difficult, more painful, more costly. It did not take long for strength to begin leaving him. Blood loss. The slow unraveling of physical stability. By the time it ended, remaining upright was no longer natural. It was effort. And then came the mockery, not as an afterthought, but as part of the design. A crown was placed upon his head, not of gold, but of thorns, pressed down with enough force to break skin and draw blood, while a robe was draped across his shoulders in imitation of royalty, turning accusation into spectacle. They struck him, spoke to him, mocked him with the very title that had become the charge. King. Not spoken in belief, but in ridicule. And when the robe was taken away, it did not simply remove the illusion. It reopened the wounds beneath it, undoing what little stability the body had begun to recover. Then the crossbeam was brought forward. Rough wood, heavy, placed across shoulders already torn open. And he was made to carry it, not in private, not shielded, but through the open streets, where the same city that had watched him enter days before would now watch him struggle to leave. Each step required more than the one before it. Balance was uncertain. Strength was fading. And under the combined weight of injury and burden, the body began to fail in ways that could not be hidden. He stumbled. Not once, but enough that it became clear he could not continue. And so another was forced to carry the beam the rest of the way, not as mercy, but as necessity, because Rome did not pause its process. It completed it. The place was called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And there, what had been building since the sentence was given reached its final form. Crucifixion was designed to be slow. That was its purpose. The condemned were fixed to the cross, either by binding or by nails, and in this case, nails were used, driven through the hands or wrists, and through the feet, anchoring the body to the wood in a way that ensured it would remain suspended. And then the cross was raised. And everything changed. Because the true mechanism of crucifixion was not the nails themselves, but what followed after, the position of the body, the way weight pulled downward, stretching the arms, tightening the chest, compressing the ability to breathe. To inhale required effort. To exhale required collapse. And so breathing became a cycle of pain. In order to draw breath, the condemned had to push upward against the nails, against torn muscle, against weakened limbs, lifting the body just enough to allow the lungs to expand. And then, as strength failed, the body would fall again. And then rise. And fall. And rise again. Each breath demanded a choice. Each movement came at a cost. And over time, that cost increased. Because exhaustion is patient. It does not arrive all at once. It builds. The arms weaken. The legs tremble. The body begins to fail not from a single wound, but from the accumulation of them all. Breathing becomes shallow, then strained, then insufficient. Crucifixion did not end life quickly. It allowed the body to reach a point where it could no longer continue choosing to live. And all of this took place in the open. People passed by. Some watched in silence, unable to look away. Some spoke. Some mocked. Some mourned. And above him, placed deliberately for all to see, was the charge. King of the Jews. Not as truth, but as warning. This is what happens. To those who step beyond their place. To those who challenge what cannot be challenged. Hours passed. The body struggled. The effort to breathe became heavier with each attempt. Strength continued to leave. And at some point, the shift occurred. The moment when the body could no longer sustain the effort required to rise again. The moment when breathing stopped being possible, not because air was gone, but because the strength to reach it was. And Jesus died. Not quickly, not quietly, but in full view of a world that believed it had just ended something. For those who followed him, this was not simply loss. It was collapse. Everything they had seen, everything they had believed, everything they thought might change, ended here, on a cross, under a sign meant to humiliate, within a death designed to erase. Because crucifixion was not meant only to kill a body. It was meant to end a movement, to ensure that whatever began with that person, ended with them. And as the body was taken down, and the noise began to fade, and the sky returned to what it had been before, it appeared that Rome had succeeded. The voice was gone. The man was dead, and whatever had begun with him was over.
And Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. Matthew 27, verse 50.
After the body was taken down from the cross, there was no sudden shift in the world around it, no visible fracture in the sky, no interruption in the steady movement of life continuing beyond that hill, only the quiet, heavy settling of something that felt, to everyone watching, completely and irreversibly finished. Because death, once it has done its work, does not announce itself again. It simply remains. Those who still cared moved carefully, not out of ceremony, but out of necessity, because there was little time and even less strength left to give, taking the body not to a place that had been prepared for him, but to one that had been offered in the final hours, a tomb not carved for this moment, but now claimed by it. There was no procession, no gathering of voices to mark the passing. Only a small number of hands doing what could still be done before the light disappeared completely, before the moment passed into something that could no longer be changed. The body was wrapped, not as preservation, but as farewell. Each movement deliberate, restrained, as though even the act of touching what remained carried its own weight, its own quiet acknowledgement that what had once been living, speaking, moving freely among them, was now still in a way that could not be reversed by anything they understood. And then it was placed inside. Not arranged, not displayed, but laid to rest within the boundaries of stone that would hold it in darkness, where sight could no longer reach and where presence would no longer be confirmed by anything except memory. And then the stone was moved, slowly, heavily, with effort that could be felt in the body, as it rolled across the entrance and settled into place with a finality that did not need words to explain itself. The sound alone was enough, because it marked a division. Before and after, what had been seen was now hidden. What had been heard was now silenced. What had been followed was now unreachable. And in that moment, the world adjusted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but inwardly. Because this is what happens when something ends in a way that leaves no room for interruption. The body is placed. The entrance is closed. The outcome is accepted. But not everyone stepped away with ease. There were those who had watched closely enough to understand that something about this man had never aligned with expectation, that even in death, there remained a tension that had not fully resolved, a question that had not been completely answered. Because movements do not always die with the one who begins them. Sometimes they scatter, sometimes they grow, and sometimes, even in silence, they wait. So measures were taken, not out of reverence, but out of caution. The tomb was not only sealed but secured, as guards were stationed at its entrance, not to honor what had been placed inside, but to ensure that nothing would disturb it, that no one would approach it, that whatever had ended would remain contained. Because certainty, in moments like this, is something people try to enforce, even when they are not entirely sure they possess it. And so the stone stood firm. The guards remained watchful. The entrance stayed closed, untouched, unchallenged. And from every visible perspective, from what could be seen, measured, confirmed, the story had reached its conclusion. There was no movement within the tomb, no sound, no shift, no indication that anything remained except what had already been placed there. Only stillness. And silence, after something like this, does not feel empty. It feels complete. It fills the space left behind and settles into it, pressing outward until there is no room left for expectation, no space left for possibility, no reason left to believe that anything could follow. Because silence is what we trust when everything else has stopped. It is what confirms the ending. It is what convinces us that nothing more is coming. And in that moment, with the stone set, the body unmoving, and the world already beginning to turn its attention elsewhere, it appeared that death had done what it has always done. It had taken what it was given. It had closed what it had claimed. And it had kept it.
And they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone, and setting a watch. Matthew 27, verse 66.
The third day did not begin with hope, nor with expectation, nor with even the smallest anticipation that anything about the world had changed during the night. It began the way grief always begins after the shock has passed, quietly, heavily, with the slow acceptance that what was lost is not returning. The city had already begun to move forward in the way cities do, carrying on with routines that do not pause for individual sorrow, while those who had followed Jesus were left to carry something far more personal, far more immediate, and far more final. Because death, once witnessed, does not easily release its hold on the mind. It lingers. It replays. It settles into certainty. And so the women came to the tomb early, moving through the dim light of morning with purpose that was not driven by hope, but by obligation, carrying spices to complete what had been left unfinished. A final act of care for a body they believed would still be exactly where it had been placed. Among them was Mary Magdalene, not arriving to witness something extraordinary, but to face something unavoidable. Because this is what love does in the aftermath of loss. It returns, even when there is nothing left to change. Even when the ending has already been written. They came expecting stillness, expecting silence, expecting the weight of finality to remain exactly where it had been sealed. But as they approached, something was wrong. Not subtly, not gradually, but immediately. The stone had been moved, not shifted slightly, not disturbed in a way that could be dismissed, but opened, the entrance exposed, the boundary broken. And in that instant, everything that had been certain, fractured, because stones like that do not move on their own, and sealed tombs do not open themselves. And so the first reaction was not belief. It was confusion, disorienting, followed quickly by fear. Because when something that should not happen does happen, the mind does not reach for miracles. It reaches for explanation. Mary Magdalene, in one account, does not fall to her knees in understanding, nor does she immediately recognize what has taken place. Instead, she assumes what would make the most sense within the world as she knows it. That someone has taken the body, that the tomb has been disturbed, that what had been finished has now been violated, because resurrection is not the conclusion we are trained to expect. Losses. And yet, the evidence remains. The stone is no longer where it should be. The tomb is no longer closed. And what had been placed inside is no longer there. The space that once held a body now holds absence. And absence, when it appears where something certain once existed, does not bring clarity. It brings questions. Where is he? Who has done this? What does this mean? And in those first moments, there are no answers. Only the growing awareness that whatever has happened does not fit within anything they understand. The silence that had once confirmed the ending is now broken, but not yet replaced with certainty. Only tension. Only the sense that something has shifted in a way that cannot be undone. Because something has. Something that does not announce itself loudly, does not force recognition immediately, but instead unfolds slowly, pressing against understanding until it can no longer be ignored. The tomb is open, the body is gone, and the world, without realizing it yet, is no longer the same.
He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay. Matthew 28 verse 6.
What followed the empty tomb was not immediate clarity, nor a unified understanding, nor a clean moment where confusion gave way neatly to certainty, but rather a widening tension that grew as reports began to circulate, quietly at first, then with increasing insistence, that something had occurred which could not be easily explained or contained. Because absence alone does not create belief. It creates questions. And questions, when left unanswered, begin to move. At first, the claim did not arrive as a declaration shouted across the city, but as something more fragile, more uncertain, carried in fragments through those who had seen something they could not fully explain, something that did not align with what they knew to be final. Jesus had been seen, not remembered, not imagined, alive, not in metaphor, not in vision, but in presence. And this is where the tension sharpens, because this claim does not settle into the mind comfortably, nor does it allow itself to be dismissed without consequence. The Gospels describe encounters that unfold in ways that resist simplification, moments where individuals who had witnessed his death now found themselves standing in front of him again, not as memory, but as reality. He speaks. He moves. He is recognized, and then, at times, not immediately recognized, as though the mind itself struggles to reconcile what the eyes are seeing. He appears to individuals, to small groups, to larger gatherings. Conversations take place. Questions are asked. Doubt is expressed. And yet, the claim persists, not as a single moment, but as a series of encounters that build upon one another, forming something that cannot be easily reduced to misunderstanding. Because misunderstanding fades. It weakens over time. It fractures under pressure, but this grows stronger. And this is where history and belief begin to press against each other. Because the claim being made is not mild. It is not symbolic. It is not something that can be comfortably placed alongside other ideas and left to exist without consequence. It demands something. If it is false, then it represents one of the most significant deceptions, misunderstandings, or constructed narratives ever sustained, carried forward not by one voice, but by many, across time and distance, without collapsing under its own weight. If it is true, then something far more disruptive has occurred. Because if a man who was publicly executed, whose death was confirmed, whose body was sealed within a tomb under guard, is now alive, then death itself has been interrupted. Not delayed, not softened, interrupted. And that is not a small shift. That is not a detail to be absorbed and set aside. That is a fracture in the most stable certainty humanity possesses. Because everything that follows human life has always pointed in one direction. Forward, into an ending that does not reverse. But this claim points backward, into something that should not open again, and insists that it has. Which leaves only two possibilities. Either the claim collapses under scrutiny, or the world itself is not as fixed as it has always appeared. And that is why this moment does not resolve easily. Because it does not allow distance. It does not remain contained within history. It does not fade into metaphor unless it is forced to. It remains, pressing, waiting, because a claim like this does not ask to be admired. It asks to be answered.
And that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 4.
If the story had ended at the cross, it would have followed a pattern the world already understood, a pattern repeated countless times before and after. A man rises, gathers attention, challenges power, and is ultimately silenced in a way that ensures both his voice and his influence fade into memory. History is filled with men like that. Men who stirred something for a moment, only to have that momentum collapse the instant they were removed. And by every measurable expectation, Jesus should have been one of them. A teacher remembered by a few. A name carried briefly before being replaced by others. A life that created ripples, but no lasting wave. Because crucifixion was designed to do more than end a life. It was designed to end impact. To ensure that whatever began with a person ended with them, leaving nothing behind but a warning. And for a moment, it appeared to have worked. The body was gone. The voice was silent. The movement should have dissolved. But it didn't. And that is where everything begins to change. Because what followed did not resemble the slow fading of a failed movement, nor did it mirror the quiet retreat of followers trying to preserve what little remained. Instead, something entirely different took place. The same individuals who had scattered in fear, who had hidden, who had struggled even to stay near the cross, did not remain in that state. They returned. Not cautiously, not quietly, but with a conviction that had not existed before. And conviction like that does not emerge from wishful thinking. It does not sustain itself through uncertainty. It requires something solid enough to stand on, something strong enough to hold under pressure. And pressure came, because the message they began to carry was not safe, nor was it easily accepted, nor did it fit within the structures already in place. They did not preach that Jesus had lived. They preached that he was alive, present, active, continuing. And that distinction matters. Because a life that has ended can be remembered, but a life that continues must be reckoned with. And so the message spread, not through power, not through force, but through persistence, through repetition, through individuals willing to carry it beyond the place where it began, into cities, into regions, into spaces where it was not expected and not always welcomed. And it did not move without resistance. There was opposition. There was persecution. There were attempts to silence, to suppress, to stop what was unfolding. Because systems built on control do not yield easily to something they cannot regulate. And yet, it continued. It moved outward, crossing boundaries that should have contained it, reaching beyond the limits that should have slowed it, carried not by structures of authority, but by people who believed enough to continue speaking even when doing so came at a cost. And that is the point where the pattern breaks completely. Because movements built on falsehood, or confusion, or temporary momentum tend to collapse under sustained pressure. They fracture. They fade. They lose coherence. But this did not. It endured. And not only did it endure, it expanded. From a small group in Judea, it spread into the Roman world itself, moving through the very system that had attempted to end it, taking root in places where it should not have survived, let alone grown. because the message carried something more than memory. It carried meaning. It reframed suffering, not as an endpoint, but as something that could exist within a larger story. It redefined death, not as an absolute, but as something that had already been challenged. It gave weight to sacrifice, not as loss without return, but as something connected to a greater outcome. Because if death had been overcome once, then it was no longer final in the way it had always been understood. And that changes everything. It changes how people see their own endings. It changes how they endure their present. It changes what they believe is possible beyond what they can see. And that is why this moment does not remain contained within its time. It does not stay within first-century Judea. It does not remain a localized belief or a passing idea. It moves across generations, across cultures, across systems that rise and fall around it. Because what began as a single claim became a foundation, and foundations, once set deeply enough, do not disappear. They support everything that is built upon them. And whether one accepts it, questions it, or stands somewhere in between, there is no denying the scale of what followed. Because this was not the survival of a memory. This was the expansion of a message that refused to die.
But this Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we all are witnesses. Acts 2 verse 32.
Easter, when stripped of everything that has been layered onto it over time, tradition, decoration, familiarity, the quiet softening that comes with repetition, is not gentle, nor is it designed to be easily absorbed without resistance. At its core, it is a confrontation, not with culture, not with ritual, but with the oldest certainty humanity has ever carried, that death is final. Because from the beginning of human experience, everything has moved in one direction, every life advancing toward an ending that does not reverse, every breath taken under the quiet understanding that there will come a moment when no more will follow. Death has always held that position, unchallenged, unbroken, absolute. It does not negotiate. It does not return what it takes. It closes and remains closed. And everything built around human understanding has accepted that boundary as fixed. Until this claim. Because the resurrection does not present itself as comfort, nor as metaphor designed to ease fear, nor as a symbolic gesture meant to inspire without demanding belief. It stands as defiance, direct, unyielding, a declaration that what has always been considered unchangeable has been changed, that the grave, which has always functioned as an endpoint, a final line beyond which nothing returns, has been opened from the inside, not by force applied from without, but by something that passed through it and did not remain contained. And that is not a small idea. It does not sit quietly beside other beliefs. It does not allow itself to be reduced without losing what makes it what it is. Because if the resurrection is true, then death is no longer what it has always been. It is no longer final in the absolute sense. It is no longer the unquestioned conclusion. It becomes something else. Something interrupted. Something that does not hold the same authority it once did. And that realization does not remain abstract. It moves inward, because if death is not final, then everything built on its finality begins to shift. Fear changes. Loss changes. The way people understand their own lives, their own endings, their own meaning, changes. Because what once stood as a closed door becomes something else entirely. Not removed, but altered. And that is why Easter does not fade into softness unless it is forced to. Because at its core, it refuses to agree with what the world has always said is inevitable. It stands against it, not quietly, but with a claim that continues to press forward across time, across cultures, across generations that encounter it and are left with the same question that began forming at the empty tomb. Is it true? Because if it is, then the grave has never held the power we believed it did. Then the ending we have always accepted as final is not the end at all. And that is not a comforting idea unless it is believed. It is a disruptive one, because it removes the certainty people have relied on and replaces it with something far less controlled. Possibility. And so Easter remains what it has always been at its center. Not a tradition, not a symbol, not a softened memory, but a claim, one that does not fade, one that does not weaken, one that continues to stand unchanged regardless of how it is received. Because before it became something people observed, it was something that happened. And if it happened, then everything that follows must be seen differently.
O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? 1 Corinthians 15 verse 55.